The year was 1884, and the Wyoming Territory was being swallowed by a white and roaring nothing. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It was a solid wall of noise and ice that slammed against the sides of the stagecoach, making the old wood groan like a dying man. Inside, Clara sat alone, her body numb. She had stopped shivering an hour ago, and that, she knew, was a bad sign. She was 25 years old, but she felt ancient, worn down to the bone by the relentless cold and the jolting of the wheels beneath her. Her hands were tucked deep in her armpits, clinging to the fading warmth of her own body. In her lap, beneath her thin wool coat, lay her valise, and inside the valise, tucked into a worn Bible, was the letter. It was a simple letter, written in a plain, strong hand. It promised a home. It promised a future with a man named Henry Talbot, a man she had never met, but whose words had been kind enough. He had paid her passage from Philadelphia, a city that had held nothing for her but factory smoke and the memory of a small grave. This letter was her entire life, the sum of all her hope. The coach, a heavy-duty mud wagon built for rough country, lurched to a halt. The sudden stillness was almost as violent as the motion had been. Clara pulled back the frozen canvas flap. The driver, a man named Silas, was a shape of bundled furs, his beard thick with ice. He was staring at something ahead of them, a low shape in the sea of white.
"This is it, miss," he yelled over the wind. "The crossroads. That's the Talbot Ranch, yonder."
Clara could see nothing but a dark smudge against the gray sky, maybe a mile distant. "We are stopping here?" Silas climbed down, his movements stiff.
I'm behind schedule, and the pass will be closed by nightfall if I don't push on. The station is 5 miles ahead."
He pulled her small trunk from the boot and dropped it into the snowdrift by the side of the track. It landed with a dull, heavy sound. "Wait," Clara said, her voice thin. She fumbled with the door latch, her fingers feeling like wooden pegs. She practically fell out of the coach, the wind immediately stealing her breath and slamming the air from her lungs. The cold was a physical blow. "You cannot just leave me here." Silas avoided her eyes. He stamped his feet, already turning back to his horses. "It ain't my choice. Miss, this is where you paid to go." "But the storm, please, it is... I cannot walk in this." He paused then and looked at her. His face was weathered, cracked like old leather, and his eyes held a deep, exhausted pity. That pity scared her more than the wind. "Miss," he said, his voice softer, but still carrying on the gale. "You best get to the house, but you ought to know. I heard at the last station, your man, Mr. Talbot." Clara's heart stopped. The letter in her valise suddenly felt like a block of ice. "Mr. Talbot?" "He passed, Miss, took ill with the pneumonia 3 days ago. Buried him yesterday. I reckon." The world, which had been a screaming white chaos, went perfectly, terribly still. The wind's roar faded to a distant hum. She heard Silas speaking again, but the words were muffled, coming from a great distance. "Awful sorry, miss, but I got the mail to think of. I can't stay." She must have said something, or maybe she just stared, because he shook his head, a gesture of finality. He climbed back onto his seat, unwound the long leather reins, and cracked his whip. The horses strained, the harness jingled, and the coach groaned forward, disappearing into the blowing snow within seconds. She was alone. The word was meaningless. She had been alone in Philadelphia. She had been alone on the train. She had been alone in the coach. But this was a different kind of alone. This was an emptiness as vast as the sky. The land was not empty. It was full of a killing cold. And it wanted her gone. Pneumonia. He was dead. The promise was broken. Her trunk sat in the snow. She looked at it, then at the dark smudge of the ranch house. She had no choice. To stay here was to die. Clara picked up her valise, leaving the heavy trunk. She could not carry both. She pushed her frozen hands back into her sleeves and leaned into the wind, taking her first step toward the Talbot Ranch. It was not a walk. It was a fight for every inch. The snow was not soft powder. It was a crust of ice over deep drifts, and she broke through with every step, the cold biting at her ankles through her thin city boots. The wind tore at her bonnet, ripping it from her head. She did not bother to chase it. Her hair, pinned tightly that morning, came undone, lashing against her face like tiny, frozen whips. She kept her eyes on the dark shape of the house. It did not seem to get any closer. She thought of Henry Talbot. She tried to picture his face from the small, faded photograph he had sent. A plain man, with kind eyes. He was dead. She felt no grief for the man, only a deep, hollow terror for herself. She was a mail-order bride with no groom. She was a piece of mail delivered to a vacant address. It took her what felt like hours, though it was likely less than one, to reach the porch of the Talbot Ranch. She was sobbing, but the tears froze instantly on her cheeks, burning her skin. Her legs would barely hold her. She used the last of her strength to climb the 3 steps and pound on the thick wooden door. She waited. The wind on the porch was somehow worse, tunneling and vicious. She pounded again, using the side of her fist. The door opened a crack. A woman's face peered out. She was older, her hair pulled back in a severe gray knot, her eyes red-rimmed and hard as granite. "What do you want?" the woman's voice snapped. I am Clara," she gasped, the air searing her lungs. "Clara, from Philadelphia, for Mr. Talbot." The woman's face contorted. The door opened wider, revealing a dark, warm hall behind her. The smell of baking bread and grief wafted out. "You?" the woman said. Her voice was low, filled with a venom that shocked Clara. "He is dead. My son is in the ground. And you show up now?" I just learned," Clara stammered, leaning against the doorframe. "The driver, please, ma'am, I am so cold." "You are too late," the woman said. She seemed to grow taller, blocking the warm light. "You think you can come here now, to his grieving mother's home? He waited for you. He got the sickness waiting at the station in this storm. This is your fault." "No," Clara whispered. "Please, I came as fast as I could." "We do not want you. You brought shame on this house, arriving like this, after he is gone. Like some vulture. Go back where you came from. There is nothing for you here." "I have nowhere to go," Clara pleaded. The small warmth from the hall was being pushed away by the cold wind. "Please, just until the storm passes. I have no money." "That is not my concern," Mrs. Talbot said. Her face was blank, a mask of cold duty. "My son is dead." The door shut. The click of the latch was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain. She did not knock again. She knew it was useless. The cold, which she had fought so hard, now flooded into her. It was no longer an enemy. It was an embrace. She turned and stumbled down the steps. She did not know where she was going. Not back to the crossroads. There was nothing there but her trunk. She walked away from the ranch, following a snow-covered fence line, her head down. The world was reduced to the sight of her own feet, clumsy and useless, punching holes in the snow. She was going to die here. The thought came to her with a strange, flat calm. She would lie down, and the white would cover her, and it would be over. The factory, the coughing, the hunger, the shame of Mrs. Talbot's words, all of it would be buried. She walked until her legs were too heavy to lift. She fell against a post of the snow fence, sliding down into the drift. The wind was quieter here, down low. It was almost peaceful. She pulled her coat tighter, though it did no good. She thought of her valise, still clutched in her numb hand. She thought of the letter inside, a promise of a home. She closed her eyes. Levi Hart saw her from 100 yards away. He was checking his fences, a miserable task in this weather, but necessary. A break in the line meant his few head of cattle would wander off and freeze. At first, he thought she was a bundle of rags blown against the post, or maybe a dead calf, but the shape was wrong. He urged his horse, Old Ben, through the drift. The horse snorted, hating the wind. Levi leaned down from the saddle. It was a woman. Her face was a pale, bluish gray. Her lips the color of a fresh bruise. Her hair was matted with snow. She was not moving. He swore, a low, rough sound swallowed by the storm. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep. He touched her neck. Her skin was like ice, but beneath his glove, deep under the jaw. He felt it, a pulse, faint, thready, but there. He did not waste time. He was not a man given to hesitation. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing. A small, frozen bird. He threw her over the front of his saddle, mounted behind her, and wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady. He turned Old Ben for home. His cabin was less than a half-mile away. A small, dark square of sod and timber hunkered low against the land, bracing itself against the wind. Smoke plumed from the stone chimney, whipped flat by the gale. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and kicked it shut. The sudden silence and warmth of the single room were dizzying. A cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a dry, fierce heat. He laid her on the bearskin rug in front of it, pulling off his heavy gloves. She was barely breathing. Her clothes were stiff, frozen to her. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. There was no gentleness in his movements, only purpose. He took his hunting knife and cut the laces of her useless, frozen boots, pulling them from her feet. Her stockings were wet and torn. He sliced them away. Her feet were waxy and white. He cut the buttons from her coat and peeled it off her. Her dress underneath was damp. He hesitated for only a second. Modesty was a luxury for the living. He cut the laces of her bodice and pulled the wet wool dress and the layers beneath away from her body, leaving her in her thin chemise. He grabbed the heaviest wool blanket from his bed, wrapped her in it, and began to rub. He rubbed her feet, her legs, her arms, trying to force the blood to move, to fight back the freeze. The skin was pale and dead-looking. She moaned, a tiny animal sound. Her eyes flickered open, pupils wide and dark with confusion. He stopped, sitting back on his heels. Clara stared. The world was brown and warm. There was a ceiling of rough-hewn logs above her. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something sharp, like whiskey. A man knelt over her. He was a stranger. His face was hard, cast in shadow by the low light of the oil lamp on the table. He looked to be in his 30s, with dark, unkempt hair and a beard that was neatly trimmed but rough. A long, pale scar cut down from his left temple, across his cheekbone, and disappeared into his beard. His eyes were the color of the sky just before the snow began. He said nothing. He had a pan of snow melting on the stove. He dipped a rag in the lukewarm water and began to wash her hands. The sting was instant, a sharp, needle-like pain that made her cry out. "It will hurt," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if he had not used it in some time. "That is good. It means they are not lost to you." He was methodical, cleaning the ice and dirt from her fingers. She saw that her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding where she had clawed at the frozen ground. He handled them not gently, but with a sureness that was almost calming. He wrapped them in clean strips of linen. Clara tried to speak. Her throat felt raw. "Where?" "My cabin." He stood up, towering over her. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing canvas trousers and a flannel shirt. "You were by the fence line, near Froze." He turned away and poured coffee from a blue tin pot into a single tin mug. He added a heavy splash of whiskey from a brown bottle. He came back, knelt, and lifted her head, holding the mug to her lips. "Drink." It was an order. She drank. The liquid was scalding hot and burned all the way down. the whiskey spreading a spider web of heat in her chest. She coughed, but he made her drink more. When she finished, he set the mug down. She looked around the room. It was small, maybe 12 feet square. In one corner was a narrow bed, neatly made. In the other, the stove. A rough table with one chair. Shelves held tins of food, books, and traps. A rifle and a shotgun rested on pegs over the cold fireplace. It was the cleanest, most orderly room she had ever seen, and the loneliest. There was one cup, one plate, one chair. She realized she was in her undergarments, wrapped in his blanket. A flush of shame rose, so hot it hurt. She pulled the blanket tighter. My clothes.
Frozen. They are by the stove.
He pointed. Her dark wool dress was hung over the chair, steaming in the heat. The man picked up her wet clothes from the floor, wrung them out, and hung them on a line near the chimney. He did not look at her while he did it. He moved with an economy of motion, wasting nothing. He finished his chores and looked at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm beating against the cabin walls. "You take the bed," he said. It was not a question. He went to the bed, pulled back the top quilt, and motioned for her to get in. Clara struggled to her feet. The blanket trailed around her. Her head spun from the whiskey and the sudden warmth. "No," she whispered. Her pride, the only thing the Talbots had not taken, flickered. "I cannot take your bed. I will sleep on the floor." Levi Hart looked at her. His expression was unreadable. He did not argue. He did not reassure her. He simply turned from the bed, grabbed a second, worn blanket from a chest at its foot, and tossed it on top of the first one. His meaning was clear. The discussion was over. Too weak and too cold to fight, Clara climbed into the narrow bed. The sheets were coarse linen, clean, and smelled faintly of soap and the cold night air. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but it was the softest thing she had ever felt. She pulled the heavy blankets up to her chin, the wool scratching her skin. The man checked the logs in the stove, then grabbed his own bedroll from a corner. He spread it on the floorboards near the hearth, as far from her bed as the small room would allow. He took off his boots, but nothing else. He lay down, his back to her, and put one arm under his head. The lamp was still burning, casting long, wavering shadows. The night pressed in. The wind battered the walls, and the small cabin creaked and groaned, a tiny ship in a vast, white ocean. Clara lay stiff, her body aching with the returning life. Her hands and feet throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. She listened to the storm, and she listened to the breathing of the man on the floor. His was slow, deep, and even. Hers was shallow, trembling. She did not know his name. She did not know if she was safe. She only knew that she was warm, and she was alive, and that a dead man's cruel mother had turned her out into the storm. And this man, this silent stranger with the scarred face, had brought her in. She must have drifted into a restless sleep, because when she opened her eyes again, the cabin was darker. The lamp was out. Only the faint, red glow from the stove's grate cut the blackness. The storm was louder, a constant, high-pitched shriek. She turned her head. In the dim red light, she could just make out his shape. He was not sleeping. He was sitting up, leaning against the wall, watching her. She could not see his expression. He was just a silhouette, perfectly still. She held her breath, a knot of old fear tightening in her stomach. He did not move. He did not speak. He just watched. Clara shut her eyes, pretending to be asleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve awake. She felt his gaze like a physical weight. Then she heard a small sound, a sigh, the rustle of the bedroll. When she dared to look again, his back was to her once more. He had turned his face away. She did not sleep again. She lay and listened to the wind until the blackness outside the single window began to fade to a flat, bruised gray. When the light was strong enough to see, she sat up. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned low. The man was gone. A moment of panic seized her. Had he left her? She threw the blankets back and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold floor. Her dress, now dry and stiff, was still hanging on the chair. She stood, unsteady, and went to the window. It was thick with frost, but she rubbed a small circle clear with her bandaged hand. The storm had not stopped, but the wind had eased. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, blurring the world. And then she saw him. He was outside, not 20 yards from the cabin, standing in a drift that came past his knees. He was cutting firewood. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up, his powerful forearms bare to the cold. He swung the axe with a steady, relentless rhythm, the thunk of the blade sinking into the wood muffled by the snow. Each time he lifted the axe, she could see the snow steaming off his shoulders and back, the heat of his labor meeting the bitter cold. He was a creature of the storm, a part of the hard, unyielding land. He did not look toward the cabin. He just worked. The snow did not stop. For 2 days, it fell with a silent, hypnotic persistence, burying the world. On the 3rd day, the wind returned, and the sky turned a dark, bruised gray. The storm, which had paused to take a breath, now settled into rage. The cabin became their entire universe. It was a small, tight box of flickering light and warmth, besieged by the howling white. The snow piled up against the single window, covering the bottom half and filtering the daylight into a dim, undersea gloom. Clara, her hands and feet healing into a painful, itching throb, fell into a routine. She could not be idle. Idleness was a luxury for women who had homes, for women who were not burdens. Levi Hart had saved her life, and she would repay him in the only currency she had: work. She rose before him, though he was never truly asleep. She would hear him stir on the floor, the rustle of his bedroll, and she would slip from the warmth of the bed, her feet hitting the cold floorboards. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her mended dress. By the time he was on his feet, she had the stove stoked and the coffee pot set to boil. He would nod, a single, sharp dip of his chin, and pull on his boots. He would take his heavy coat, the one she had not touched, and go out into the gray roar to tend his horse and chop more wood, always more wood. While he was gone, she cooked. The supplies were simple: salt pork, beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee. She made biscuits. She soaked the beans. She swept the floor. She found his mended clothes in a small chest and washed them in a bucket of melted snow, her hands turning a red in the lye soap. She hung them near the stove to dry. She was grateful. The gratitude was a heavy stone in her chest. She was alive. She was warm. She was fed. But she was uneasy. Levi Hart remained a stranger. He was polite, in a cold, distant way. He never spoke unless she spoke first, and his answers were short, clipped things that ended the conversation before it began. He ate quickly, his eyes on his plate. He would take his tin cup of coffee and sit on the floor by the hearth, not in the chair, staring into the flames as if reading a book only he could see. He was a man wrapped in silence, and she was afraid to break it. She learned the map of him, the way his eyes, the color of a frozen creek, would go flat and hard when he looked out the window, the way he moved without a sound, and the scar. She saw it clearly on the 2nd day. He was cleaning his rifle at the table, the lamplight falling on his hands, his left hand. It was not just his face that was marked. A thick, white scar, old and puckered, ran from the knuckle of his little finger, across the back of his hand, and disappeared under his shirt cuff. It looked as if the hand had been laid open to the bone. She stared, unthinking. He stopped his work, the oiled rag going still. He did not look up. but he slowly, deliberately, curled his left hand into a fist, hiding the mark. Clara flushed and dropped her gaze back to the pan of beans she was scrubbing. She did not look at his hand again. The days blurred. The wind howled. The snow piled higher. The cabin grew smaller. The silence thicker. It was on the fourth night, listening to the cabin timbers groan under the weight of the snow on the roof, that she finally asked the question that had been burning in her. She was mending her own dress, the fabric thin and worn. He was reloading cartridges at the table. "That ranch," she said, her voice small. The one where I was—" He did not stop his work. "The Talbot Ranch." "Yes." She took a breath. "You said you knew them. Mrs. Talbot, she was—" Clara's voice faltered. She could not bring herself to say the word cruel. "She was grieving." Levi finished seating a bullet and placed the cartridge in a neat row. "Henry's mother, aye, she is that. Did you know Mr. Talbot? Henry?" He paused. He set the cartridge down. "I worked there, on that ranch." "Oh." Clara waited for him to say more. He did not. "Was it recently?" "No," he said. He picked up another casing. "It was a long time ago." His voice was flat. It was a door shutting. She understood. The Talbots were not a subject he would speak on. She bent her head back to her sewing. The tiny cabin filled once more with the sound of the wind and the metallic click of the reloading tool. The distance between them felt as wide and as cold as the prairie outside. He was her savior, but he was also her jailer. The storm held them captive, but so did his silence. That night, the storm reached its peak. The wind did not just howl, it shrieked, a high, thin sound like a woman in agony. Clara lay in the bed, blankets pulled to her chin, rigid. Sleep was impossible. The cabin seemed to be breathing, the walls flexing under the assault. Levi was on the floor, a dark shape in his bedroll. She thought he was asleep. Then he moaned. It was a low, broken sound, full of a pain that cut through the storm's noise. He shifted, his limbs tangling in his blankets. "No," he whispered, a raw, pleading sound. "No, Sarah, do not." Clara went cold. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear of the storm, now hammered with a different, sharper emotion. "Sarah." He said the name again, not a whisper, but a choked cry. "Sarah!" He thrashed, sitting bolt upright. His head was in his hands. Clara lay frozen, barely breathing. She did not move, did not make a sound. She was an intruder, listening to a private grief. Who was Sarah? A wife, lost to the pneumonia that took Henry Talbot? A sweetheart? The name hung in the dark cabin, a ghost between them. Levi did not lie back down. He sat there, his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the faint red glow of the stove. He sat like that for hours, a statue of regret, until the first gray light crept through the snow-caked window. The confession, though not meant for her, changed things. He was not just a silent, scarred man. He was a haunted one. He was a man who grieved. The snow stopped. The wind died. The silence that fell over the world was vast and absolute. When Levi opened the door that morning, the snow was a solid white wall, drifted higher than the doorway itself. He had to dig his way out. They were marooned. The world was gone. The silence in the cabin could not hold. It had been stretched too thin, and now it had to be filled. It began with a spoon. Clara was trying to stir a thick pot of cornmeal mush. The only spoon was a short, metal one, and the heat from the stove made the handle scorching hot. She was using a rag to hold it, but it was clumsy, and she burned her fingers, dropping the spoon with a small gasp. Levi, who had been reading a worn, coverless book by the window, looked up. He saw her wince and stick her red fingers in her mouth. He said nothing. But the next day, he sat by the fire, He was not reading. He had a piece of dried pine in his left hand and his knife in his right. For hours, he worked, the cabin filled with the scent of pine and the soft, rhythmic sound of the blade slicing wood. He worked with a slow, patient intensity, his scarred hand surprisingly nimble. That evening, when she set the plates on the table, he wordlessly placed a new spoon beside her bowl. It was a wooden spoon, long-handled and perfectly smooth. The bowl of it was deep, the handle shaped to fit a hand. It was simple. It was beautiful. Clara picked it up. The wood was still warm. She ran her thumb over the smooth grain. It was the first gift she had been given in as long as she could remember. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat thick. He just nodded, already turning back to the stove. The next day, he came in from the shed, snow clinging to his beard. He shrugged off his heavy coat, and she saw the sleeve was torn, a long, L-shaped rip in the canvas where it had caught on a nail. He grunted in annoyance, examined the damage, and hung the coat on its peg by the door. Later, while he was outside again, checking the trap lines he had set near the cabin, Clara took the coat down. She found his sewing kit in a small wooden box. It held coarse linen thread, a block of beeswax, and 3 heavy needles. Her fingers, though still tender and stiff, went to work. It was not like mending her own thin dress. This was thick, unyielding canvas. She pulled the thread through the wax, stitched the tear with small, tight seams, and then, for good measure, sewed a reinforcing patch of scrap leather she found in the box over the mend. When he returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he found her biting the thread to finish. He stopped, just inside the door. He watched her hang the coat back on the peg. He did not speak. She did not speak. But the next morning, as he put the coat on, Clara saw him pause. He ran his gloved thumb, slow and deliberate, over the patch she had sewn. The wall of his silence had a crack in it. That night, the air was different. The confessions of their hands, the spoon, the patch, had said more than their voices ever could. The quiet was no longer empty. It was waiting. She was by the fire, pretending to read the almanac she had found on the shelf, though the words made no sense to her. "I sold everything I had." Her voice was so quiet, she wondered if she had even spoken aloud. Levi, who was cleaning his pistol, went still. His hand stopped moving on the oiled rag. "My mother passed 2 years ago," Clara said, speaking to the flames. "The factory, the coughing took her. There was nothing left, just debt, just the smell of the dye vats." She touched the cheap fabric of her dress. "I sold our kitchen table, my mother's locket. I sold everything I owned in this world just to buy a ticket. And this one dress." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a dry, cold shame. "I came here for a promise, a letter from a man I never met. I just wanted to belong somewhere, to not be a burden on anyone. Now, I have nothing. I am no one, just a woman you found in the snow." Levi carefully, slowly, set the pistol frame on the table. He laid the rag beside it. He stared at his own hands, his scarred hand resting on his good one. "I have not spoken to another soul since September," he said. His voice was rough, rusted from disuse. "It is January now. Not one word. Not until you—" He looked up from his hands and met her gaze. His eyes were dark, the color of the storm clouds. "The folks in town, they stay clear of me. The preacher crosses the street when he sees me. They have their reasons." Clara held her breath. "I killed a man," he said. The words landed in the small cabin with the weight of stones. Clara did not flinch. She had seen death. She had seen violence in the alleys of Philadelphia. This was just the truth. "He was my brother," Levi said. His voice dropped, became hollow. "My younger brother, Ethan." He said the name as if it hurt his mouth. It was a gunfight, over cattle. He was stealing from our own herd. We had a joint brand, our father's brand. He was selling them. For whiskey, for cards. I found him with the rustlers he was in with. I told him to come home. I told him to stop. Levi's hands clenched into fists on the table, the scar on his cheek pulled tight. He was drunk. He called me a name. He drew on me. I was faster. I was always faster. He stared at the wall, seeing something she could not. I shot my own brother. I watched him die in the mud. He turned his gaze back to her. It was bleak, stripped bare of all defense. I do not expect forgiveness for that, not from God, not from any man. He looked at her, as if daring her to judge him. And not from you. The cabin was so still she could hear the tiny hiss of the melting snow dripping from the eaves. Clara looked at this man, this killer, this savior. She saw the scar on his face and the one on his hand, and she knew they were nothing compared to the one he carried inside. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in his own past. She felt no fear. She only felt a vast, aching kinship. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. Did he deserve it? It was the only question that mattered. Levi looked away from her, back into the fire. The flames cast dancing, cruel shadows across his face. A long, terrible minute passed. I do not know anymore, he said, his voice ragged. I just know. I am the one who is still here. That night, sleep was a different thing. The confessions settled in the small room, a shared weight. Clara lay in the bed, but her sleep was not the blank exhaustion of the nights before. It was deep, and it was troubled. She dreamed she was back in the snow. The wind was screaming. The cold was in her bones, a final, fatal numbness. She was dying. She looked up, and Levi's face was above her, silhouetted against the white sky. He was not a stranger. His eyes were full of a sorrow she recognized. He knelt, and his scarred hand reached for her. He pulled her up, out of the snow, and his arms were strong. He was not cold. He was warm as the fire. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to glowing embers. She was tangled in the blankets, her skin prickling with heat. She could not lie still. She slipped out of the bed, pulling the top blanket around her shoulders. Levi was not on his bedroll. He was sitting at the table, in the faint red glow from the stove. She saw the brown bottle of whiskey. There were 2 tin cups on the table. He was sitting in the darkness, waiting. He looked up as she approached, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. He did not seem surprised to see her. He just pushed the second cup toward her. The nights are cold, he said. She sat in the cabin's only chair, across from him. She pulled the blanket tighter. He lifted the bottle and poured a small amount into her cup. He poured a larger measure for himself. They did not speak. There were no words left. Clara lifted the cup. The cheap whiskey was sharp, burning her throat, but it sent a welcome heat through her body. The firelight flickered, a faint, pulsing red. It painted the shadows on his face, catching the pale line of the scar on his cheek, the rough texture of his beard. He watched her over the rim of his own cup. This time, when their eyes met, he did not look away, and neither did she. They sat there for a long time, sharing the silence and the whiskey, while the fire burned low and the world outside lay buried in a deep, merciless white. The world began to thaw. It happened not all at once, but in small, agonizing drips. The first sound Clara heard on the 8th day was not the wind, but the tick, tick, tick of water falling from the eaves. The snow on the window pane, which had been a solid, opaque wall, grew heavy and slid away, letting in a sudden, blinding slice of gray light. Levi was at the door, staring out at the new world. The snow was still deep, a vast, white ocean, but the air was still. The sky was high and pale. The siege was broken. It is stopping, she said, her voice quiet. He nodded, pulling on his hat. The trail to town will be passable by tomorrow, maybe the day after. He turned to look at her, his face in shadow, his eyes unreadable. I can take you in. The stage line might be running again. Clara's heart, which had felt so still and safe in the small cabin, gave a violent lurch. Town. The word was a threat. She looked down at her hands. They were red and raw from lye soap and hot water. But they were healing. The frostbite had scabbed over. And then what, Mr. Hart? There is a boarding house, he said, his voice practical. Mrs. Gables, you could get a room, find work. Work as what? She asked, a new, sharp bitterness in her voice. A laundress? A cook in a saloon? I have no money. You know I have no money. She had confessed as much. The valise in the corner held only a Bible, a spare chemise, and a letter of promise from a dead man. She was a pauper. He had no answer for that. He just stared at the floor. I cannot go to town, she said, her voice flat. I will not be a beggar. Mrs. Talbot, she stopped, the shame of that encounter rising like bile. There is no place for me there. He looked up. You cannot stay here. Why not? The question was out before she could stop it. He looked around the tiny, one-room cabin, as if the answer was obvious. The narrow bed she slept in, his bedroll on the floor, the intimacy of their shared silence. It ain't proper. Proper? She gave a short, harsh laugh. Was it proper for Mrs. Talbot to shut the door in my face? Was it proper to be left to freeze? I am past worrying about what is proper. Mr. Hart, I am worried about surviving. She stood up, her small frame rigid. I will not be a burden. I will work. I have been working. You need help. Your coat was torn. Your food was low. I can cook. I can sew. I can learn. He watched her, his expression hard to read. He was a man who lived by simple, hard rules, and she was breaking all of them. I will not go to town, she said again, her voice softer, but no less firm. I will earn my keep, until the spring. Perhaps, until I can find a way. Please. He looked at her for a long time. She saw the conflict in his eyes. The world outside had rules, and he, the outcast, still seemed to value them. But the world inside this cabin had its own logic. She was here, she was alive, and she was refusing to leave. He gave a single, sharp nod. The horse needs seeing to, and the traps must be checked. It was not an agreement, but it was not a refusal. It was, for now, enough. The next few days, the dynamic between them shifted. She was no longer a patient, a survivor he had rescued. She was a hand. She rose before him, her feet hitting the cold floor. And she did not wait for him to stoke the fire. She did it herself. She dressed in the cold, her back to him as he rose from his bedroll. She followed him outside into the blinding, sunlit snow. The world was sharp and clean. The air so cold it hurt to breathe. He showed her how to feed old Ben, how to measure the oats, how to check his hooves for ice. Her hands were clumsy, and the horse, sensing her fear, shied away. He smells you are afraid, Levi said, his voice flat. He took her hand, the one that was not bandaged, and pushed it firmly against the horse's muzzle. Let him know you. Do not pull back. His hand was rough, calloused, and large. It covered hers, pressing it to the warm, velvet nose of the animal. A strange, sharp heat shot up her arm. She did not pull back. She helped him clear the snow from the small shed roof. She stacked the wood he split. She learned to set the snares for rabbits, her stomach turning at the grim task. But her hands doing the work, she was clumsy with the axe. But he did not mock her. He simply took it from her, showed her how to stand, how to let the weight of the head do the work. He was a quiet, patient teacher. They worked side by side, speaking in the short, necessary language of chores. Pass the rope. More water. The latch is frozen. The silence between them was no longer the empty, heavy thing it had been during the storm. It was the shared quiet of labor. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, exhausted. She would be mending his socks, her stitches small and neat. He would be oiling a trap, the metallic snick of the springs loud in the room. It was almost domestic. It was almost peaceful. And it was a lie. Clara would feel his eyes on her. She would look up from her sewing, and he would be watching her. His gaze intense, that same unreadable expression he'd had the first night. He would look away immediately, but the heat of his gaze lingered. One morning, he came in from checking his traps. 3 rabbits tied to his belt. He dumped them on the table. "We need supplies. Salt. More flour. Coffee is almost gone." He did not need to say the rest. She was coming with him. She could not be left here. They rode into town 2 days later. He rode Old Ben, and she rode a smaller pack mule, her valise tied behind her. The world felt huge and bright. The snow on the plains was dazzling, the sky a deep, aching blue. Levi rode ahead, his back straight, his rifle in its scabbard. He looked like a guardian. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Clara did not feel entirely alone. The town was little more than a single, muddy street clawed from the snow. A few false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith, and Henderson's Mercantile. As they dismounted, the town went quiet. It was not her imagination. A man rolling a barrel onto the boardwalk stopped, his arms straight. 2 women in dark coats, gossiping by the Mercantile window, fell silent, their heads turning as one. They stared. Levi ignored them, tying the horses to the hitching post. He seemed used to it, wrapped in his cold, hard silence. Clara followed him into the store, her head held high, though her stomach was a knot of ice. The store was warm, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, and pipe tobacco. Mr. Henderson, a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles, was behind the counter. His eyes flicked from Levi to Clara and back again. His polite smile was thin as paper. "Mr. Hart," he said, his voice strained. "Storm passed. I see." "Aye," Levi said. He handed the storekeeper a list. "Need these." As Henderson turned to gather the items, the 2 women from the boardwalk entered. They did not look at Clara, but she felt their eyes on her. They moved to the far side of the store, by the bolts of calico, and the whispering began. It was low, sibilant, like dry leaves skittering on a frozen pond. The one from the stagecoach. Talbot's bride. Showed up after he was dead. Living out there. With him. For over a week. No good. You can see it. Shameful." Clara's face burned. The shame was so hot, so sudden. It made her dizzy. She wanted to run, to hide in the cabin, to pull the storm back over them. She took a step back, bumping into a stack of feed sacks. Levi, who had been counting coins onto the counter, did not turn, but his whole body went rigid. Clara saw his protective glance. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her as if she were his territory, and the whispers were stones being thrown at her. And in her shame, a new, strange feeling bloomed, a dark, hot flicker of pride. He was an outcast, a killer, and he was hers. She was his. The town saw them as a pair, and in that moment, she did not mind. Just then, the door swung open, the bell jangling loudly. A large man entered, shaking snow from his heavy buffalo coat. He was broad, with a ruddy face and a thick, blonde mustache. "Hart!" the man boomed, his voice filling the store. He looked at Levi, then his eyes slid to Clara, traveling down her worn dress and back up to her face. His smile was slow and unpleasant. "Heard you found yourself some company out on the line. Things must be lonely, to take up with Henry Talbot's leavings." Clara flinched as if he had struck her. "Leavings? Like scraps from a plate." Mr. Henderson froze, a tin of coffee in his hand. The whispering from the women stopped. Levi turned. He did not turn quickly. He turned slow, deliberate. He faced the man. "Amos Finch," Levi said. His voice was not loud. It was soft. It was the quietest, most dangerous sound Clara had ever heard. "That is enough." Finch laughed. A short, barking sound. "Is it? I hear she was turned out by the Talbots. You cannot blame a man for picking up what's been thrown in the trash. Tell me, Hart, is she worth the trouble, or—" Levi moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his gun. He simply crossed the 3 feet between them and stood directly in front of Amos Finch. He was taller than Finch, harder. The scar on his face seemed to pulse. He stepped between Clara and the rancher, blocking her from Finch's view. "You will not speak to her," Levi said. His voice was so low Clara could barely hear it. "You will not look at her, and you will leave this store." Finch's smile faltered. He was looking at a man who had killed his own brother. The rumors were one thing. The reality of the man, standing close enough to touch, was another. Finch's eyes darted to the holstered pistol on Levi's hip, then back to his cold, gray eyes. "I ain't afraid of you, Hart," Finch blustered, but he took a half-step back. "I did not ask if you were afraid," Levi said, his voice still a dead, flat calm. "I told you to leave." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the stove. Finch's face was red. He looked around. At Henderson. At the women. At Clara, hidden behind Levi's shoulder. He was measuring the cost. He found it too high. With a grunt, Finch turned, his heavy coat swirling, and shoved his way out the door, letting it slam shut behind him. Silence. Levi stood with his back to Clara for a moment. He took a deep, slow breath. Then he turned back to the counter. "My supplies. Mr. Henderson." The ride home was silent. The bright, clear day was gone. The sky had turned a flat, metallic gray, and the wind was picking up, sharp and cold, biting at their faces. It was the feel of a new storm. Clara was shaking. She was cold, but it was not the wind. It was a rage so deep it made her tremble. She was angry at Finch, angry at the women, and, irrationally, angry at Levi. He had defended her. He had stood between her and the world. But in doing so, he had claimed her in front of them all. He had confirmed their gossip. They were not just a man and a woman trapped by a storm. They were Hart and his woman. When the cabin came into view, a low, dark shape against the new snow, she could not bear it. As soon as he dismounted, she slid off the mule. Her legs stiff, he began to unhitch the supplies. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, her voice high and thin. He stopped, a sack of flour in his hands. "Do what?" "In the store, with that man. You did not have to say anything. You just made it worse. You made them right." He dropped the sack by the door and turned to her. His face was hard, shut down again. "He had no call to speak to you that way. And you had call to step in, like you owned me?" He took a step toward her. "Is that what you think?" "It is what they think," she cried, the tears she had held back in the store now coming, hot and furious. "They think I am your whore, that I am just leavings." She spat the word like poison. "Their words do not matter," he said, his voice rough. "They are the only words I have. I have no name. I have no home. I am just the woman they whisper about. The widow bride who moved in with the man who killed his brother. We are a matched pair, are we not? The town monsters." He just stared at her, his face a mask. "On the ride home," she said, her voice breaking, "I confronted you. I asked you why." He looked confused. "What?" "In my head," she whispered. "I asked you 100 times, and you said, what did I say?" She looked at him, her vision blurring. "You said, you shouldn't have to bear their words." His face did not change, but his eyes softened. just for a moment. I did not say that. But you thought it, she whispered. He did not deny it. The wind tore at her thin coat. The first flakes of the new storm began to sting her cheeks. She was so tired. The fight drained out of her, leaving a cold, hollow ache. I am so tired, she wept, the words torn from her. I am so tired of being judged, of being unwanted. I ran from Philadelphia to escape it. I came here, and I was turned away because I was too late. I came here, and now I am nothing. I am just a thing to be mocked by men like Amos Finch. She sank down onto the woodpile, burying her face in her raw, bandaged hands. You should have left me. You should have left me in the snow. It would have been kinder. Levi stood over her, a dark, immovable shape. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just let her cry. After a long time, he said, I do not care what they say. She looked up at him, her face wet. You say that, but I do not care, he said each word like he was driving a nail. Let them talk. Let them rot. Their words are wind. She saw, then, that he was trembling. His hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He was not trembling with cold, or with rage. It was something else. It was the same tremor she felt in herself, a deep, shaking hunger for something other than this. He wanted her. The knowledge was as stark and as cold as the wind. He, the killer, the outcast, wanted her, the leavings. That night, the new storm hit. It was a smaller, meaner storm, full of ice and wind. The cabin was filled with the sound of it, and the sound of their silence. They ate their meal of beans and biscuits without a word. The air was thick, charged with her tears and his trembling admission. When it was time for sleep, Clara could not do it. She could not get into that bed, the bed he had given her, the bed the town thought they shared. To sleep there tonight felt like a confirmation. It felt like accepting the name Finch had called her. She took one of the blankets from the bed. Levi, already unrolling his bedroll by the hearth, paused and watched her. She carried the blanket to the other side of the small hearth, as far from him as she could get, and set it on the cold floorboards. He stopped, his bedroll half open. The floor's too cold. It is fine, she said, her voice muffled. She would not look at him. You will be frozen by morning. Take the bed. No. He stood up to his full height. Clara, take the bed. She turned, her eyes flashing in the firelight. I will not. I am done being a burden. I am done taking things that are not mine. She sat on the floor and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her back to him. She was shaking, but not from the cold. She heard him whisper, Then I'll sleep on the floor. She thought he was mocking her, repeating her own words from that first night, but when she looked, he was standing over her. The firelight cast his shadow long against the wall. He stood there for a long, terrible moment. She saw the fight in him, the war between his hard-won solitude and the man he was. Then he bent down. He did not speak. He took her by the arm, his grip firm. No, she whispered, pulling back. Let me be. He did not listen. He pulled her gently, but irresistibly, to her feet. The blanket fell away. He kept hold of her arm, leading her the few steps to the narrow bed. She thought he would just put her in it, as he had the first night, and walk away. She thought he was just being practical, keeping her from the cold. He pulled back the quilts. He did not let go of her arm. He nudged her to sit on the straw mattress. And then he did not walk away. He sat beside her. He took off his boots, one by one, dropping them to the floor. The sound was loud in the small room. He turned, his face inches from hers in the dim, red light from the stove. He said nothing. He simply lifted her legs, swung them onto the bed, and pulled her down onto the mattress. And before she could speak, or move, or even breathe, he lay down beside her, on top of the covers, and pulled her into his arms. The night was a held breath. He had pulled her into the bed, but he did not pull her close. They lay stiffly, on their backs, his arm, the one that had guided her, now resting awkwardly on the quilt between them. They were both fully dressed, their boots on the floor, but the line had been crossed. The small cabin, which had been a refuge, was suddenly a cage, too small for the heavy, trembling energy that filled it. The storm, which had renewed its assault, was a dull roar outside. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the stove and the ragged, shallow sound of their breathing. Clara lay rigid, staring at the log ceiling. She could feel the heat radiating from him. It was a solid, living thing, just inches from her side. He was so still he might have been carved from stone, but she could feel the tremor that ran through his body. He was fighting something. Levi stared into the darkness, his eyes burning. The scent of her, soap, and the faint, clean smell of the cold she had brought in filled his head. He had not been this close to another person in years. Not since. The memory rose, unbidden, as it always did in the dark. Sarah, his brother's widow, after he had shot Ethan, after the blood and the mud and the terrible silence. He had been the one to tell her. He had walked to the ranch, his pistol still heavy on his hip, and found her on the porch, waiting for a husband who would never come home. He remembered her face, pale and stunned. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with hatred, but with a bottomless, empty despair that had broken him more than any bullet could have. He had stayed on, trying to run the ranch for her, his guilt a heavy yoke around his neck. He had worked from sunup to sundown, punishing himself, trying to pay a debt that had no price. And one night, in her grief, she had come to him. She had been drinking. She had mistaken his guilt for kindness, his penance for strength. She had touched his face, her hand trembling. "He is gone, Levi," she had whispered, her breath smelling of whiskey and sorrow. "But you are here." He had recoiled. He had pushed her away. Not gently. The look on her face then, the shame, the humiliation, was a fresh wound on top of the old. He had left the ranch the next day. He had taken his share of the cattle, built this cabin far from everyone, and walled himself in with his penance. He had sworn he would never touch another soul, never risk that kind of damage again. Now, this woman was beside him, this stranger, with her own deep, visible wounds. He had pulled her into his bed, an act of impulse, of selfish need. He was no better than Sarah, driven by loneliness. He was breaking his own vow. The tremor in his body was a silent, violent no. Clara felt the shiver that ran through him. It was not a shiver of cold. It was a deep, painful tension, as if he were being torn apart from the inside. She had seen this kind of pain before, in the faces of men in Philadelphia who had lost everything. It was the pain of a soul trapped. She was not afraid of him. She had seen his anger in the store, but this was not anger. This was grief. This was the man who had whispered Sarah in his sleep. This was the man who had killed his brother and did not know if he deserved it. She understood. He was like her. He was carrying a weight so heavy it was crushing him. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head. In the dim red glow from the stove, his profile was a hard, sharp line. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. She moved her hand, the one that was no longer bandaged, just red and raw. She moved it across the coarse quilt, inch by inch, until her fingers brushed the back of his hand, his left hand, the scarred one. He flinched, a sharp, sudden intake of breath, but he did not pull away. She let her fingers rest on the old, puckered skin. It was rough, like old leather. She traced the long, pale line from his knuckle toward his wrist. It felt like a map of all the pain he held inside. "You do not have to carry it alone," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet, it was almost part of the storm, but in the small, charged space, it was as loud as a gunshot. Levi stopped breathing. Her words, her touch. It was not the grasping, desperate touch of Sarah's grief. It was quiet. It was steady. It was an offer. It was forgiveness. He turned his head. His face was just inches from hers. He saw her eyes, wide and dark in the gloom. And in them, he did not see judgment. He did not see fear. He saw himself. He saw another broken, lonely soul. He had been in a cold, dark place for so long. He had forgotten what warmth felt like. He moved. He did not think. He just acted. He leaned in, and his lips, chapped and rough from the cold, touched hers. The first kiss was soft as her words. It was hesitant, a question. It was just the brush of his mouth against hers, a shared breath. Clara's eyes fluttered shut. She did not pull away. She did not move. She just accepted. And that, her simple, quiet acceptance, broke the dam. It broke everything. The years of loneliness, the guilt, the cold, empty nights and the days of hard, meaningless labor. All of it shattered. He kissed her again, and this time, it was not soft. It was fierce. It was a drowning man's gasp for air. His arm, which had been a barrier between them, wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest. His other hand came up to cup her face, his rough fingers tangling in her hair. Clara gasped, and he kissed her deeper. She was overwhelmed. This was not the fumbling, shy kiss of a suitor. This was a storm. This was the raw, desperate hunger of a man starved of human contact. And it woke a hunger in her she did not know she possessed. She was tired of being cold. She was tired of being alone. She was tired of being unwanted. She kissed him back. Her small hands, which had been resting on his chest, came up and clutched his shirt. She held on, as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. It was a collision. It was years of her own loneliness, the empty factory, the small grave, the cold coach, the slammed door, breaking at once. They did not undress. There was no thought of that. It was not about that. It was about heat. It was about life. It was about two people, broken by the world, finding a piece of solid ground in each other. They kissed until their lips were bruised, until the air was gone from their lungs. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in her scent, his entire body shaking. She held his head, her fingers stroking his hair, her own tears, hot and sudden, leaking from her closed eyes. He pulled back, just enough to look at her. His eyes were dark, wild. He saw the tears on her cheeks, and his expression crumpled. He thought he had hurt her. "Clara," he whispered, his voice ragged. "It is all right," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "It is all right." He did not kiss her again. He just held her. He pulled the heavy quilts over both of them, tucked her head under his chin, and wrapped his arms around her as if he were shielding her from the storm, from the world, from everything. Clara lay against his chest. She could hear his heart, hammering like a drum. Slowly, slowly, beginning to calm. She felt the solid, warm wall of him. He was no longer a stranger. He was no longer her savior or her jailer. He was just Levi, and she was not Leavings. She was just Clara. She fell asleep, not to the sound of the wind, but to the sound of his breathing. Dawn came cold and pale. The storm had blown itself out, leaving a sharp, bright silence in its wake. Clara woke slowly. The first thing she felt was warmth, a deep, steady warmth she had not felt in years. The second was weight. A heavy arm was draped over her waist, holding her securely. She opened her eyes. The cabin was filled with the clear, gray light of morning. She was tucked against Levi's side, her head on his shoulder. Sometime in the night, they had shifted, finding a more natural comfort. He was still asleep. His face turned toward her. In sleep, he looked different. The hard lines around his mouth and eyes were gone. The scar on his cheek was just a pale, silvery mark, not a brand of guilt. He looked younger and infinitely tired. His breathing was deep and even. She lay still, watching him. She felt the rough wool of his shirt against her cheek, the solid muscle of his chest beneath. She was in a killer's bed. She was in his arms. And for the first time since she had stepped off the train in Wyoming, she felt completely, absolutely safe. A small, strange feeling curved her lips. It was an unfamiliar sensation, a lightness in her chest. She smiled. His eyes opened. He did not move, did not startle. He just woke, his eyes clear and gray, focused on her. He saw her face, so close to his. He saw the smile. His expression tightened. The hardness returned. He remembered, all at once, the kiss, his weakness. He had pulled her into his bed, used her loneliness to soothe his own. He was just like Finch, taking what was not his. He pulled his arm away, as if her skin had burned him, and sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He sat with his back to her, his head in his hands. Clara's smile faded. The cold rushed into the space he had left. "Levi, you should get dressed," he said. His voice was a low, rough growl. He did not look at her. "The light is up." He stood, grabbed his boots, and pulled them on with sharp, angry movements. He stoked the fire, his back a rigid wall of rejection. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her. The cabin was cold again. The night, the kiss, the warmth. It had been a dream. She was a fool. "Levi," she said, her voice stronger. He stopped, his hand on the stove latch. "Last night," she said, I am not sorry." He went perfectly still. He did not turn. "You should be—" "Why?" she demanded, her old fire returning. "Because you are? Because you saved my life, and now you regret it?" He turned, slowly. His face was a mask of self-loathing. "I had no right." "And I had no choice? Is that it? You think I am so weak, so broken, that I just fell into your arms?" She threw the blanket off and stood from the bed, facing him from across the room. "I am not Sarah. Levi." His head snapped up. His eyes widened. "I heard you," she said, her voice softer. "In the storm. I know you are grieving. I know you are in pain. So am I. Last night, it was not a sin. It was two people in the dark, trying to find a way." He stared at her, the truth of her words hitting him. She was not weak. She was, perhaps, the strongest person he had ever met. She had faced death, shame, and judgment, and she was still standing, her chin up, meeting his gaze. He took a step toward her, and then another. He stopped just in front of her. He reached out, his hand hesitating. He did not touch her face. He touched the sleeve of her dress, his fingers brushing the worn wool. "Clara," he said, and his voice broke. He said nothing else. She smiled again, that same small, fragile smile. "Go," she said gently. "Chop the wood. I will make the coffee." The days that followed were different. The ice between them, and the fire, had settled into something new, a quiet, gentle warmth. They worked together, their old rhythm returning, but it was changed. He showed her how to properly sight his rifle, his hands resting on her shoulders to steady her stance. And he did not pull away immediately. She cooked, and he sat at the table, watching her, a small, quiet smile touching his own lips. They talked. He told her about growing up in this territory, about his father, who had taught him to track and to build. He did not talk about Ethan. He did not talk about Sarah, but he talked. She told him about Philadelphia, not the factory, but the memories before, the taste of hot chestnuts from a street vendor, the sound of the bells on a Sunday morning. They shared meals, and the silence was no longer heavy. It was comfortable. One evening, he was carving another piece of wood. She was mending his shirt. She hummed a small, forgotten tune. He looked up. "That is pretty." She flushed. "My mother used to sing it." "Sing it," he said. And she did. Her voice was thin, but clear. She sang the simple song, and he stopped his carving, just listening. When she finished, he nodded, a look of deep, quiet peace on his face. He said, "Thank you." It was a small, fragile life they were building, a bubble of peace in the middle of a hard, unforgiving world. The world did not wait long to burst it. A week later, there was a knock on the door. It was not a polite knock. It was a heavy, insistent pounding. Levi, who was cleaning a rabbit, looked up, his hand dropping to the knife on his belt. Clara's heart stopped. He went to the door and opened it a crack. A tall man in a black coat stood there. His face was thin, his eyes hard and bright. It was the preacher, Reverend Josiah. "Mr. Hart," the preacher said, his voice loud, meant to carry, "I have come in the name of the Lord." "The Lord is not welcome here," Levi said, his voice flat. He started to close the door. The preacher put his boot in the jamb. "I have heard the talk. Sinner, I have heard of your shame. You are living here in flagrant sin with this fallen woman. You defile the memory of your brother, and you condemn this woman's soul to eternal fire." Clara, standing by the hearth, felt the blood drain from her face. Fallen woman. Levi shoved the door open. He did not step out. He stood in the frame, filling it, a low, animal growl rising in his chest. "Get off my land."
"I am here to save you,"
the preacher insisted, holding his Bible up like a shield.
"This woman, this Jezebel, who came to trap a good man and, failing that, took up with you."
"I will not tell you again," Levi said. His voice was deathly quiet. The preacher looked into Levi's eyes, and whatever he saw there made him falter. He took a step back.
"You will answer for this. Both of you. God will not be mocked."
Levi said nothing. He just closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the cabin. He turned. Clara was standing exactly where she had been, her hands white-knuckled, her face the color of ash. "Clara," he started. Before he could take a step, she heard it, a new voice, from outside, a woman's voice, sharp and full of spite. It was one of the women from the mercantile, who must have come with the preacher. "He is right, Reverend, wasting your breath on them. She is nothing but the ranch whore, living in that killer's bed. It is a disgrace." Whore. It was the word Amos Finch had implied. It was the word Mrs. Talbot's eyes had screamed. It was the word that branded her, that erased everything she was, everything she had tried to be. The fragile peace of the cabin shattered. The warmth, the laughter, the quiet songs. All of it was a lie. She was not Clara. She was not safe. She was the ranch whore. She looked at Levi, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered terror. He was looking at her with pity, with anger, but he could not protect her from this. No one could. She could not bear it. She could not bear his pity. She could not bear the world's cruelty. "No," she whispered. It was a strangled, broken sound. Before he could move, before he could speak, she ran. She tore the cabin door open, shoving it so hard it slammed against the outer wall. She ran past the stunned preacher and the gossiping woman. She did not grab her coat. She did not grab her bonnet. She just ran, her thin house shoes sinking into the melting afternoon slush. She ran into the cold. She ran away from the cabin, away from the town, toward the only thing that made sense. She ran toward the woods, their dark, silent trunks promising a kind of peace. Levi stood stunned for a solid second. He saw her face as she passed, the look of utter, soul-deep despair. The word whore echoed in the cabin, in his head. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He grabbed his heavy coat from the peg, Ignoring the preacher, who was yelling after him, he ran to the shed, his mind cold and sharp. It was almost dusk. The light was fading fast. The temperature was dropping. She was in a thin dress. He saddled old Ben with frantic, angry speed, his hands yanking the straps, his teeth bared. He swung into the saddle, his rifle still in its scabbard, and kicked the horse into a gallop. He did not have to search. Her footprints were a clear, desperate trail in the snow, leading away from the path, heading straight for the deep, darkening, snow-choked woods. The woods were dark, the air sharp with the coming night. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and the snow, which had been soft slush in the afternoon, was beginning to crust over. Levi pushed old Ben hard, his eyes fixed on the frantic, small footprints. She was not running smart. She was running blind. Fueled by shame and terror, she stumbled through deep drifts, her skirt catching on the skeletal, ice-covered branches of sleeping thickets. He saw a scrap of her dark wool dress caught on a thorn, a tiny, sad flag of her despair.
"Clara!"
he yelled, his voice raw. It was swallowed by the pines. The woods were dense, the light a dim, bruised blue. He was not just angry at the preacher, at the gossiping woman, at the entire world that had judged her. He was angry at himself. He had brought her into his world, a world where he was already a pariah, and he had let their poison touch her. He had seen the look on her face when that word, whore, had hit her. It was the same look he had seen in the snow, the look of death. He rode faster, ducking under a low-hanging, snow-heavy branch. His fear was a cold knot in his stomach, colder than the air. He had saved her from the ice once. He did not know if he could do it again. The tracks led down a steep embankment, toward the sound of moving water. He heard it before he saw it, the dark, gurgling sound of a creek, fighting to stay alive against the freeze. He dismounted, tying old Ben to a sapling, and plunged down the hill on foot, his boots sinking deep. He found her by the water's edge. She was half collapsed, just as the outline had promised, slumped against a fallen log, her body shivering in deep, racking convulsions. Her skirt was torn at the hem, her hands bare and shoved deep into her armpits. Her face was a pale, waxy gray, streaked with tears that had frozen to her skin. She was staring at the black, icy water as if it were an invitation. "Clara!" She looked up. Her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly empty. The fight was gone. "Go away, Levi," she whispered. Her voice was a dry, broken thing, barely audible. "Just go away." He walked toward her, his movement slow. She flinched, like a wounded animal he was approaching. "You will freeze," he said, his voice rough. "You have no coat. Come home." "Home?" She gave a short, terrible laugh that turned into a cough. "That is not my home. It is your cabin, and I am your... She could not say the word. She choked on it. "I am the woman who lives there. I am your shame." She pushed herself up, her back against the log, trying to find some last shred of dignity. "I cannot live as a burden. Levi, do you not see? I am a curse. I brought this on you. The preacher, that woman, they hate me, and they hate you more because of me." She was shivering so hard she could barely speak, but the words poured out, cold and sharp. "You deserve peace. You carry so much. Your brother, I see it in your sleep. You deserve to be left alone, to heal. Not my ruin. I am just filth they found on the road." He had heard enough. He crossed the last few feet and knelt in the snow in front of her. He grabbed her arms, his grip hard, forcing her to look at him. "Peace," he said, his voice a low, desperate rasp. "You think I had peace before you?" He shook her, not to hurt, but to make her understand. "My life was a cold room. It was gray. It was getting up, chopping wood, checking traps, and going to sleep, just to do it all again. It was silence. It was remembering. I have not known one single hour of peace since the day I shot Ethan. Her eyes focused on his, startled by his raw, violent honesty. Not 1 hour, he repeated, his voice thick. Until I heard you humming by the fire. Until you put your hand on my scar. Until I woke up this morning, and you were there. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his gaze burning into her. I have never known peace until you... Clara, do you hear me? You are not my ruin. You are the only thing that is not. She stared at him, her chapped lips parted. The tears that had been frozen on her cheeks melted from the heat of his words, of his closeness. They do not matter, he said, his voice softening, but still fierce. Their words are just noise. You are not a burden. You are everything. He did not wait for her to answer. He stood, pulling her up with him. She was weak, her legs buckling. He did not hesitate. He stripped off his heavy canvas coat, the one she had mended, and wrapped it around her. It swallowed her whole, hanging past her knees, heavy with his scent, his warmth. He bent and scooped her up into his arms, as he had that first day. But this was not the same. He was not rescuing a stranger. He was claiming his own. He carried her up the steep bank, his boots finding purchase in the snow, his arms tight around her. She was light, a small, cold bundle. She buried her face in his neck, her shivering finally beginning to ease against the solid heat of his body. He mounted old Ben, settling her in front of him, her back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding the coat closed, shielding her from the wind. He turned the horse and began the slow walk back to the cabin. The world was dark now, the woods black and silent, the only light from the stars on the white snow. He did not speak, but as they rode, he leaned his head down, his lips brushing the top of her hair. I have got you, he whispered, the promise a rough vibration against her skull. You are safe. I will not let them touch you. I will not let them harm you. It is just us. He said it over and over, a quiet chant against the cold, and Clara, held in the arms of this scarred, broken man, finally believed him. When they reached the cabin, the preacher and the woman were long gone. The night was still, the air sharp. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The cabin was cold. The fire he had built that morning burned down to dull, gray embers. He set her gently in the chair by the hearth. She was exhausted, passive. He did not speak. He went to work. He moved with a focused, angry energy. He went to the woodpile and began to build a fire, not a small, practical fire, but a roaring, defiant blaze. He packed the stove with logs until it was full, and the flames leaped up, casting a wild, dancing orange light across the small room. He was at war with the cold, with the outside world. He put the coffee pot on, then knelt in front of her. He pulled off her wet, torn shoes, his hands chafing her frozen feet, forcing the blood to move. The pain was sharp, but she welcomed it. It was proof she was still alive. You are all right, he murmured, his head down. You are all right. He made her drink the hot, whiskey-laced coffee. He made her eat a piece of dry biscuit, watching her until she swallowed. He worked without stopping, his face set in grim, protective lines. He was walling them in, building a fortress of heat and light against the judgment outside. When she had stopped shivering, when color had returned to her face, he stood up. The fire was roaring. The cabin was almost too hot. The wind had risen again, and it howled around the corners of the small cabin. A high, mournful sound, like the voice of the preacher, like the grief of the world. He looked at her, and she looked at him. The tiny room was full of all the words they had not said. Go to bed, Clara, he said, his voice soft. Get under the covers. Get warm. She was too tired to argue. She nodded, stood, and went to the narrow bed. She didn't bother to undress. She crawled under the heavy quilts, her damp dress clinging to her, and watched him. He did not unroll his bedroll. He took the remaining blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed, walked to the spot on the floor beside her, and sat down, his back against the bed frame. He wrapped the blankets around his shoulders. He was a sentinel, guarding her sleep. She drifted, her body aching, her mind numb. She fell into a shallow, restless sleep, the sound of the howling wind mixing with the memory of the woman's voice. Whore. She woke some time later. The cabin was dark, lit only by the fierce, red glow of the stove. The wind was a solid wall of sound. It was a terrible, lonely noise. But she was not alone. She felt him. He was still there, sitting on the floor beside her. She could hear his quiet breathing. "Levi?" she whispered. He stirred. "I am here. Go back to sleep." "You will be cold," she said. "The floor is cold." "I am fine." She pushed herself up on one elbow. She looked down at the dark shape of his head. He was guarding her, separating himself, but she did not want a guard. She lifted the edge of the heavy quilts. It was a simple, quiet gesture, an invitation. "Do not be a guard," she whispered, her voice trembling. Be with me." He was still for a long, long moment. The only sound was the wind, howling its grief. Then he stood up. He did not just get into the bed. He stood over her in the red, flickering light, and she watched him. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt, his movement slow, deliberate. He pulled it off. The firelight played over the hard muscles of his chest, and over the old, pale scars she had only glimpsed before. He was a map of survival. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots, dropping them to the floor with a soft, heavy sound. Clara's heart was hammering. This was not the frantic, desperate kiss of the night before last. This was a choice. She sat up and, with trembling fingers, she unlaced the front of her damp dress. She pulled it off her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. She shed the judgment of the town, the shame of the preacher. He watched her, his eyes dark, unreadable. Then he lifted the quilts and slid into the bed beside her. He did not grab her. He did not kiss her. He just lay on his side, facing her, and propped himself on one elbow. Looking down at her, he reached out, his calloused, scarred hand coming up to her face. He did not touch her skin. He gently, so gently, brushed the damp hair back from her forehead. She looked at him, and she was not afraid. "Clara," he whispered, as if the name itself was a prayer. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was slow. It was tender. It held no desperation, only a deep, profound, and searching warmth. It was a question and a promise. She kissed him back, her small, cold hands coming up to rest on his scarred chest. She felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm. Outside, the wind howled like all the loss in the world. His, hers, the loss of his brother, the loss of her hope, the loss of their reputations. Inside, there was only this. He kissed her neck, her shoulders, his touch reverent. She clung to him, her body, which had been so cold, now blooming with a heat that had nothing to do with the stove, the ache of their separate losses, the raw, open wounds of their pasts, did not disappear. They simply met. They flowed together, and the cold, sharp edges of their grief began to soften, turning into a shared, living warmth. This was not a sin. It was a healing. It was two souls, judged and cast out, finding a place of mercy in each other. Morning brought no peace. Clara woke first, tangled in the blankets and Levi's arms. He was sound asleep, his face peaceful in the gray light, his breathing deep and slow. She smiled, a true, quiet smile, and let herself rest, just for a moment, in the safety of his embrace. Then she heard it. A horse snorted, too close to the cabin, and it was not old Ben. She froze. Levi was awake instantly. His eyes snapped open. A hunter's instinct. He was on his feet before she could even speak, pulling on his trousers, his pistol in his hand.
"Stay down," he hissed.
Clara scrambled, pulling the sheet up to her chin, her heart a cold stone in her chest. A man's voice, loud and confident, shattered the morning stillness. "Hart! Levi Hart! Come on out! We know you are in there!" Levi moved to the window, rubbing a small patch of ice clear. His body went rigid. "Finch!" he spat. "Amos Finch, and 2 others. They have stars."
"Justice! Hart!"
Finch yelled again, his voice closer.
"We got a warrant. Bring out the woman."
"What do they want?" Clara whispered, terror rising in her. "You—" He finished pulling on his boots, his movements economical and deadly. He did not look at her. He grabbed his shirt. "They want you." He unbarred the door and stepped out onto the small porch. He did not slam it. He just stood there, his pistol held loosely at his side, pointed at the snow. 3 men on horseback sat 20 yards from the cabin, their horses blowing steam in the frigid air. Amos Finch was in the middle, a smug, triumphant grin on his face. The 2 men beside him were thin, hard-looking men, their coats pinned open to show the tin stars on their vests. "That is far enough. Finch," Levi said. His voice was calm, but it carried in the cold, still air. "We got a warrant for the woman. Hart." One of the deputies, a man with a weasel-like face, called out. He unrolled a piece of paper. "A warrant for what?" "For her," Finch said, his grin widening. He was enjoying this. "Seems your mail-order bride is not who she claims to be. We sent a wire to the U.S., Marshall in Cheyenne. Got a reply on the telegraph this morning." Levi stood motionless.
"She is a criminal. Hart!"
Finch declared, his voice booming. "Fled Philadelphia on charges of theft. Used falsified mail-order documents to pay her passage.
She is a wanted woman, not just a fallen woman. Hart, a thief!"
Behind the door, Clara put her hand over her mouth, a silent scream building in her throat. It was true. The locket, her landlady's locket. She had sold it, telling herself it was just wages owed, but it was theft. The past she had run from had finally caught her. Levi did not turn. He did not look back. His eyes were locked on Finch. "She is not going anywhere," Levi said.
"That is not your choice. Hart!"
the weasel-faced deputy said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol.
"We are here to take her in. Stand aside."
"No," the word was flat, final.
"Do not be a fool. Hart,"
the other deputy said. He seemed younger, more nervous.
"This is not your fight. You are on my land,"
Levi said, his voice dropping. "And you are not taking her." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Still protecting her. She is just a common thief. Hart, a lying piece of trash who—" Finch's hand, which had been resting on his thigh, moved. It dropped toward the holster on his hip. He never cleared the leather. The gunshot was a single, deafening crack that shattered the morning. It echoed off the trees and rolled across the white plains. Levi stood, his arm outstretched, his pistol smoking in his hand. Amos Finch stared, his mouth open, his eyes wide with a stupid, profound surprise. He looked down at his right hand, the one that had been grabbing for his gun. It was a ruin of blood and splintered bone. His pistol, which he had half drawn, fell from his useless fingers into the snow. He screamed. It was a high, thin, unbelieving sound. The 2 deputies froze, their own guns half drawn. They had come to arrest a small, frightened woman. They were facing a man who had just, with impossible speed, shot the gun out of their companion's hand.
"He drew on me!"
Levi's voice was a roar, directed at the deputies. His pistol was now leveled at the weasel-faced man.
You both saw it. He drew on me. On my property. You shot him, the younger deputy stammered, his pistol wavering. He is bleeding, the weasel-faced man yelled, his eyes wide. You just shot a deputized officer of the law. Hart! Finch was sworn in this morning.
Levi's face went pale. He had not just shot Finch. He had shot a lawman.
We have to get him to town,
the young deputy shouted, his panic overriding his fear.
He will bleed to death. This is not over. Hart! The weasel-faced deputy screamed, his face contorted with rage and fear. He grabbed the reins of Finch's horse. You will hang for this. We will be back. We will be back with a posse, and we will burn you out.
They wheeled their horses, Finch clutching his bloody hand to his chest, moaning, and galloped away, kicking up a spray of snow. The silence that fell was absolute. It was broken only by the sound of water dripping from the eaves, and the sound of Finch's horse, standing abandoned, nervously blowing. Levi did not move for a long time. He watched them until they were small, dark specks. Then, slowly, he lowered his arm. Clara ran out onto the porch, the heavy quilt clutched around her.
Levi!
He turned. His face was grim, set like granite, but his eyes were clear. The decision was already made. He stepped inside the cabin. Is it true? He asked, his voice quiet. The theft. She could not lie. Not now. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Yes, she whispered. I was desperate. I had to pay for the ticket. I took a locket. I told myself it was not stealing, but it was. He nodded once. He did not care. He turned from her and threw a large canvas sack onto the bed they had just shared. He began to pack. He moved with that same grim, efficient purpose. He grabbed the box of ammunition from the shelf. He took the remaining coffee, the last of the salt pork, the bag of flour. What are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling. They will be back, he said, his back to her. He was not lying. They will be back with a posse. They will not just come for you. They will come for me. I shot a deputy. Oh, God, she whispered, her hands rising to her mouth. This is my fault. Levi, I am your ruin. He stopped. He spun around and grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard enough to hurt. Listen to me. He forced her to meet his eyes. I do not care about their laws. I do not care what you did in Philadelphia. I know what I am. I shot my brother. I just shot Finch. And I am not the man who is going to stand by and watch them put you in chains. He let her go, his voice softening. Get your things. Whatever you have. Where are we going? He was already at the wall, taking his rifle from its pegs. He checked the action, then shoved a box of cartridges into his coat pocket. They will expect us to go north, toward the pass. We are going south. South? She asked, pulling on her own worn dress with shaking hands. To where? Colorado, he said. He did not look at her. He was already checking the cinch on his saddle. It is a long ride, a hard one, but the territory is new. A man can get lost there. A woman can. He paused, his hand on the saddle, and looked at her. He looked at her, standing there in her stocking feet, her hair undone, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Hope. We can get lost there, he said. Together. The judgment of the world, the shame, the past. It was all just noise. There was only this man, and the hard, dangerous freedom he was offering. She did not hesitate. She ran to her valise, grabbed the only thing she owned, her mother's Bible, and shoved it into the canvas sack. She pulled on her boots, her coat. In less than 5 minutes, they were ready. He saddled old Ben in the pack mule. He tied the supplies down with a frantic, practiced speed. He helped her onto the mule, his hands strong and sure on her waist. He swung up onto his horse. He looked back, just once, at the small cabin, their fortress, their prison, their home. Smoke was still curling from the chimney. The fire he had built for her was still burning high. He turned his face south, his expression hard. He kicked old Ben into a trot. Clara did the same, falling in beside him. They rode away from the cabin, away from the law, away from their pasts, toward the vast, empty, and merciless white of the plains. They rode south. They did not ride on the open plains or follow the wagon ruts. Levi kept them to the high, wind-scoured ridges where the snow was thinner, or down in the frozen beds of meandering creeks where the banks hid them from view. They were fugitives. Every shadow was a pursuer. Every plume of smoke on the horizon a posse. The land was barren, an endless, blinding white. The sun, when it broke through the flat gray sky, was not warm. It was a sharp, cold enemy, a piece of polished steel that struck the snow and reflected back, burning their eyes and offering no heat. They rode with their heads down, their faces wrapped in strips of cloth Clara had torn from her spare petticoat. Levi was silent, but it was a new silence. It was not the withdrawn, haunted silence of his cabin. It was the alert, deadly quiet of a hunter. His rifle was not in its scabbard. It lay across his lap as he rode. He was not looking for game. He was watching their back trail. He had not just shot Amos Finch. He had shot a deputized man. He had run. There was no going back from that. He had tied Clara to his fate, and his fate, he knew, was a rope. The guilt of it was a cold, hard knot in his gut, heavier than the guilt for his brother. He had pulled her from the snow, only to throw her into the fire. Clara rode beside him on the mule, her small figure slumped with exhaustion. But she did not complain. She did not cry. The terror and shame that had broken her had been burned away, replaced by a grim, exhausted resolve. She had seen the look in his eyes when he told her to get her things. It was not the look of a man saving a victim. It was the look of a man claiming his partner. She had chosen this. She had chosen him. She would ride until she could not ride any more. Their supplies, packed in such desperate haste, were meager. The salt pork was gone in 3 days. The flour, mixed with snow and cooked into a flat, tasteless dough over a tiny, smokeless fire, lasted 5. By the end of the first week, they were down to a handful of roasted coffee beans, which they chewed for their bitter energy, and a few ounces of beans. The horses suffered, their ribs beginning to show. They had to stop often to let the animals paw through the crusty snow for the dead, dry grass beneath. On the 8th day, the wind turned. A low, dark line of clouds gathered in the northwest, the same direction from which they had fled. It was a new storm, a late winter blast, and they were caught on the open plain with no shelter, no food, and no strength. "We cannot stop," Levi said, his voice a raw rasp through his frozen scarf. "It will kill the horses." "We cannot go on," Clara whispered back, her hands so numb she could no longer feel the reins. Levi scanned the horizon, his eyes raw and red from the wind. He was searching for a dip, a ravine, anything, and then he saw it, a dark smudge, almost invisible against the graying land. It was too low, too square to be a rock. "There," he said, pointing. It was an abandoned line shack, a small, miserable hovel, half sod, half rotting timber, used by ranchers during summer roundups. It was the ugliest, most welcome sight Clara had ever seen. They reached it as the first flakes began to spin. The door was gone, ripped from its leather hinges. Part of the sod roof had caved in, leaving a gaping hole. Inside, it was a single, tiny room, thick with the smell of old damp and rat droppings. But it had 3.5 walls, and in the corner sat a small, rusted iron stove, its pipe broken. It was shelter. Levi pulled the animals into the lee of the wall and covered them with the remaining blankets. He took his axe, the one tool he had saved, and began to cut branches from the few stunted, frozen willows nearby. Clara huddled inside, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable waves. The hope that had kept her going was gone. They had run, only to be trapped here, to die of cold and hunger in a place worse than any Philadelphia tenement. Levi came back, his arms full of wood. He did not speak. He jammed the broken stovepipe back together as best he could and built a small, smoky fire. The heat was meager, but it was heat. They sat on the dirt floor, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the last of their food, a single, rock-hard biscuit she had saved from the cabin. She broke it in two, her hands shaking, and held half out to him. He looked at the small portion, then at her. He shook his head. "You eat it." "We share," she said, her voice flat. "Or neither of us does." He took it. They ate the dry, tasteless crumbs. The silence broken only by the wind screaming through the gaps in the walls and the desperate, hopeless gnawing of their own hunger. That night, Clara fell into a shivering, exhausted sleep, curled against the wall. Levi stayed awake, his rifle across his knees, watching the black, empty space where the door had been. He was colder than he had ever been in his life, a deep soul cold that the small fire could not touch. He was failing her. He had saved her from the storm, from the deputies, only to lead her here to starve. His guilt was a physical weight, pressing him into the frozen earth. He thought of Ethan, and the hot, angry blood in the mud. He thought of Finch, and the spray of red against the white snow. He had brought nothing but ruin to everyone he had ever touched. Sarah, Ethan, and now, Clara. His eyelids grew heavy. The cold, the hunger, and the days without rest pulled him down. He drifted into a shallow, agonizing sleep, his head against the sod wall. He dreamed. It was not the cabin. It was not the muddy field where Ethan had died. It was the ranch, years ago, on a bright summer afternoon. He and Ethan were boys, fishing in the creek, their bare feet dangling in the cold water. Ethan, his face young and unlined, turned to him, holding up a string of small, silver fish, and he was laughing. The sound was so real, so clear. Levi felt his chest ache. The dream shifted. Ethan was standing in front of him, the man he had become, but the anger was gone. The whiskey madness was gone. He looked clear-eyed. He looked sad. "You have spent enough time in the cold." "Levi," Ethan's ghost whispered. The voice was not an echo. It was real. "It was not all you. It was me, my weakness, my fault." Levi tried to speak, to say the words he had carried for years. "I am sorry. I did not mean to." But Ethan held up a hand. "Stop paying for my sins. Stop living in my grave. You saved her. Now live." The ghost looked past him, at Clara, huddled in the corner. "Live while you can, brother. Do not let her freeze." Levi woke with a violent gasp. The fire was out. The cabin was pitch black and Arctic cold. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering. He heard Clara, a small, choking cough. He moved to her in the dark, his hands finding her. Her skin was on fire. "No," he whispered. He fumbled for a match, his hands shaking. He struck it, the tiny flame flaring. Her face, in the brief yellow light, was flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and fast. She coughed, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the tiny space. He lit the lantern. She was delirious, muttering, her head moving back and forth on the frozen ground. Pneumonia. The word hit him like a bullet. The same sickness that had taken Henry Talbot. The sickness of the cold, of exhaustion, of despair. It had found her. A terror, cold and absolute, seized him. He would not lose her. He had not survived his brother, shot a lawman and crossed a frozen hell, only to have her stolen by a fever in a mud hovel. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the cold, to death, to God. "You will not have her." He went to work. He tore at the rotted timbers of the shack with his bare hands, splintering the wood, and rebuilt the fire in the stove. stuffing it until the rusted metal glowed a dull, dangerous red. The shack filled with smoke and a desperate, scorching heat. He ripped his own undershirt into rags, soaked them in melted snow, and bathed her face, her neck. Her skin steamed. He held her, forcing lukewarm water between her chapped, cracked lips. She did not know him. She was back in Philadelphia, muttering about the factory, about her mother. "It is so cold. Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. "The dye, it gets in your lungs." He held her, cradling her head in his lap. He rocked her, wrapped in his own coat, trying to pour his life, his warmth, into her. "You are not there, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "You are with me. You are in Wyoming. No, we are in Colorado. We are going south." He was sleepless for 2 days, and then 3. The storm raged, trapping them. He kept the fire blazing. He hunted, going out into the white roar. He came back with nothing. The world was dead. On the 3rd night, she was fading. Her breathing was a faint, shallow rasp. Her skin was no longer hot. It was cool and damp. He pulled her onto his lap, her back against his chest, and wrapped every blanket, every coat around them both. He was terrified. He knew, with a primal certainty, that if she fell asleep now, she would not wake up. He had to keep her here. He had to keep her awake. "You have to fight," he whispered, his lips against her hair. "You cannot leave me, not now." He began to talk. He had never spoken so much in his life. He whispered stories to her, his voice a low, continuous rumble against her ear. He was painting a future, trying to anchor her soul. "There is a valley," he whispered, his eyes closed, seeing it in his mind. "I saw it, years ago, when I was trapping. It is south of here, near the foothills. It is untouched. Clara, no one is there. The stream is so clear, you can see the stones on the bottom. And the trees, aspens, thousands of them. Their leaves turn yellow in the fall, like gold. You would like the aspens." She did not respond, but her breathing seemed to steady. Just a little. He kept talking. He told her about his father, a quiet man who had taught him how to read the land. He told her about his first horse, a stubborn buckskin he had named Ben, after the old man. "And we will build a cabin," he whispered, his voice growing stronger, desperate. "Not a soddy, not this hole. A real cabin, pine logs. I will cut them myself, and we will have a floor, a real wood floor. You will not have to sleep on the ground ever again, I promise you." He talked all night. He described the fireplace he would build, the garden she would plant. He described the color of the sun rising over the valley. He held her, and he talked, and he poured every last ounce of his hope, his strength, and his dreams into her, demanding she stay. When the gray, flat light of the 4th morning filled the shack, the fever broke. She woke, her eyes clear, but impossibly weak. She was lying in his arms. His face was gray with exhaustion, his beard matted with ice. He had not slept. "Levi," she whispered. Her voice was a bare thread of sound. His head snapped up. He looked at her, his eyes wild. He saw her looking back at him. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound that was half sob, half relief. "I am here," he said. 2 days later, the storm was gone. A new wind blew from the west, a warm, strange wind that smelled of damp earth. A Chinook, the great thaw had begun. Levi, hunting with a desperate, renewed strength, had snared 2 rabbits. He boiled the meat into a thin, rich broth, and he fed it to her, spoon by spoon. The strength returned to her, slowly. They rode south, away from the line shack. The world was no longer white. It was a vast, muddy, brown mess. The plains were ugly, scarred by the winter, but here and there, a miracle. The first tiny, vibrant green shoots of new grass. They crossed a wide, shallow river, the water cold and fast. "The Platte," he said. They were in Colorado territory. They were free. They rode for another week, moving slowly, letting Clara regain her strength. And one evening, they crested a high, grassy ridge. Levi stopped his horse. Clara rode up beside him. She looked down, and her hand went to her mouth. It was there. It was not a dream. It was a small, perfect valley, cupped in the hand of the foothills. A bright, clear stream cut through a meadow of knee-high grass, stands of aspen, their leaves just beginning to bud in the pale green of new life. Dotted the slopes. The air was clean, and the only sound was the wind in the pines and the rush of the water. It was untouched. It was quiet. It was safe. Clara turned to look at him. His face was worn, his scar a pale white line against his weathered skin. He was watching her, not the valley. She smiled, her eyes filling with tears that were not for sorrow. "You were right, Levi," she whispered. "It is green." They built their new life from the ground up. They started with a lean-to, a simple shelter of pine boughs near the creek. The first night, they lay on a bed of soft pine needles, sharing a blanket, too exhausted to speak. Then they began the cabin. This time they worked side by side. He taught her how to swing the axe, to find the grain of the wood. She learned to use the draw knife, peeling the bark from the pine logs in long, fragrant strips. He notched the logs, his hands sure and strong. She gathered moss and clay, chinking the walls against the wind. It was not his cabin, it was theirs. He was a patient, quiet teacher. She was a quick, determined student. They worked from the first light of dawn until the dusk turned the valley purple. They built a real stone fireplace. He split shingles for the roof, and, just as he had promised, he laid a floor of smooth, flat-hewn planks. "No more cold floors," he said, wiping sweat from his face. She smiled, her hands covered in mud from the chinking. "Not for us." They finished it as the summer bloomed, the valley bursting with wildflowers and the sound of birds. It was small, just one main room and a tiny bedroom, but it was solid. It was theirs. One evening, after they had eaten a meal of trout Levi had caught in the stream, they sat on the small porch they had built. The air was warm, and the sky was a deep, soft velvet, full of stars. Levi was mending a piece of harness, his hands busy. Clara, cleaning up their few supplies, found it in the bottom of his canvas sack, a small, worn harmonica, its metal tarnished. "You play?" she said, holding it up. He looked up, and a faint flush rose on his neck. "No, my father did. He gave it to me. I carry it." She took it, wiping it clean on her apron. She sat on the step beside him. She had not heard music, true music, in years. She put the metal to her lips, shyly, and blew a single, trembling note. Then she began to play. It was a simple, hesitant tune, the song her mother used to sing, the one she had hummed in the old cabin. The melody was thin, but clear, and it floated out into the quiet valley, mixing with the sound of the creek. Levi stopped his work. His hands went still in his lap. He watched her. The low, golden light of the new-lit lantern touched her face, turning her hair to honey. She was not the pale, terrified woman he had pulled from the snow. Her face was tanned by the sun, her hands strong and capable. She was beautiful. She was home. She finished the tune, the last note hanging in the warm air. The silence that followed was full and peaceful. She looked at him, seeing the quiet, gentle way he was watching her. She smiled, a full, real smile, born of safety and of peace. She set the harmonica on the step. She thought of that first night, in his old cabin, the fear, the cold, the shame, her weak, proud insistence. "I will sleep on the floor." She looked at their new home, at the cabin they had built, at the simple, sturdy bed inside, the one they had made together. She reached out and put her hand on his. the scarred one. "This time," she said softly, her voice clear in the dusk, "I will sleep wherever you are." He turned his hand, his rough, warm fingers lacing with hers. His grip was strong and sure. Later that night, they lay together in the bed they had built. A small, low fire burned in the hearth, not for heat, but for comfort. Its warm glow filled the small room. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her hand resting over his heart. She could feel its steady, slow beat. Their pasts were not gone. He would always be the man who had shot his brother. She would always be the woman who had fled a theft charge, who had been turned away by a grieving mother. Those things were a part of them, like his scar. But here, in the quiet of their valley, in the warmth of the fire, the sharp edges were fading. They were just stories. Their power to harm burned away. Outside, the land remained what it was. High on the ridge, a wolf howled, a lonely, wild sound. The winter would come again. The land was, and always would be, merciless. But it did not matter. Inside the walls they had built, they had carved a small circle of light. They had made a place of mercy for each other. Levi held her, his arm tightening around her. He thought of the blizzard, of the line shack, of her fever. He thought of the posse that was, perhaps, still searching for a man and a woman who no longer existed. He leaned down and whispered into her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he did not need to name. "We survived the cold. Clara, we can survive anything." She sighed, a small, soft sound of pure contentment, and settled closer. The fire burned low, the embers glowing like sleeping eyes. The night, no longer an enemy, closed gently around their small cabin and around two souls, finally at rest. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment in English with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and let us know your thoughts.